in Plain Speaking by Merrill Miller wrote that Harry Truman learned that Herbert Hoover was in Washington and sent a car for him. Well, there's no contradiction to any of these. Probably Harry Truman told the staff he had written to Herbert Hoover, so they would think it was in writing and couldn't be changed. And probably Mr. Truman learned that Herbert Hoover was in town because they had talked about it when he first called Mr. Hoover. Anyway, I like my version best. I don't know who told me this story. I think it was Bunny Miller, Mr. Hoover's longtime and very loyal secretary, and a very lovely lady who signed her letters with a little picture of a little bunny rabbit. Anyway, I think mine's the most dramatic, and I'm going to stick to it. Anyhow, I have the microphone. There. Truman, in his diary the day after he met with Mr. Hoover, the night he met with Mr. Hoover, wrote, "Saw Herbert Hoover. Had a pleasant and constructive conversation about food and the problems of presidents of the U.S., two in particular." Later he remarked that Herbert Hoover was the only other man who has, quote, "sat in this place," or who has endured constantly being compared to Franklin Roosevelt. Now, these were not the only things these two men had in common. They both left office with the albatross of unpopularity draped around their necks. They were the only two presidents to be booed when they threw out the first ball of the baseball season. And they were both ignored by their successors. Just as Franklin Roosevelt completely snubbed Herbert Hoover, Dwight Eisenhower ignored Harry Truman. In fact, Eisenhower's successor, Truman's fellow Democrat John Kennedy, all but ignored Harry Truman. Now, that might have had something to do with the fact that Mr. Truman used to refer to John Kennedy as that boy. And is reported to have said on more than one occasion, "That boy talks pretty." Well, I had Mr. Truman appointed Herbert Hoover to coordinate the shipment of food to the war-ravaged areas of Europe. Herbert Hoover had been appointed to a similar position by Woodrow Wilson after World War I, and had done such a magnificent job that there were statues of our American president erected in various parts of Europe, including towns in Russia, where they remained even through the tensions of the Cold War. While I was working for Mr. Hoover, as the second Hoover Commission went out of existence, I was given the opportunity, working for Mr. Hoover, with him in his efforts to get adoption of the recommendations of the Hoover Commission that had not immediately been adopted. I had a stock speech that I made those days called $10,000 a minute, which is the amount of money that it would have saved the federal government if the unenacted recommendations of the commission had been adopted. Today that would probably be about $50,000 a minute that it would save. Of course, many of those were adopted as we went on. Now, before I became an admirer of Harry Truman, and before I learned of the friendship between these two men, I made the mistake of making an uncomplimentary remark about Harry Truman in the earshot of Herbert Hoover. And I found out what a very intensive lecture can be all about. I was sat down and had it explained to me why I was wrong in this. Now, similarly, Harry Truman would set anyone straight, or possibly the correct wording would be take the skin off of anyone who said anything negative about Harry Truman. Merrill Miller, in Plain Speaking, wrote that during his interviews with Mr. Truman interrupted him and said, "You be careful what you say about Herbert Hoover, because he's a friend of mine." Later, when Merrill Miller asked Mr. Truman why, when he left the presidency, he didn't go to Gettysburg, a reference to Eisenhower, or the Waldorf to live, Herbert Hoover shot back, "Leave the Waldorf towers out of it. Be careful what you say about Herbert Hoover, because he did some very important things." One time, Mr. Miller asked Truman if he and Herbert Hoover ever discussed politics. Harry Truman said no, never. We would never have agreed. But there were a lot of other things to talk about. In his book on Truman by David McCullough, he wrote the following words that were very, very true. He wrote, "The restoration of Herbert Hoover to public service and public esteem was not only a right decision, but one that said much about the essential qualities of Truman." No truer words were ever said. When, long after Herbert Hoover and both Harry Truman were out of office, they finally got around to dedicating a Herbert Hoover Museum in Iowa, his home state, Harry Truman drove from his home on Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri, all the way to Iowa by himself to be with his friend, to once again pay respects to the chief. And it was very much appreciated by Mr. Hoover. Greatest gift that God can give a man is a true friend. Certainly in this regard, he blessed Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman, and through them, all of the United States of America. There have been many changes made in the last 60 years in the political landscape. Many. And I think it would be nice if more of the people in the current landscape recognize that we had two presidents who put aside partisanship long enough to be good friends. Could maybe disagree on politics, but were friends nevertheless, and could agree to be friends. I think it would make a nice role model for some people today. Also, I sincerely believe, having known both of these men and known that they were statesmen, that if they were alive today, they could discuss politics and they would agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al. If you ever get a chance to talk with Al one-on-one, those are just a sample of some of the stories. Al has led a very amazing life, and any time you get to spend with him is valuable time, and I'd urge all of you to do that. As a token of our thanks for speaking here today, on behalf of the committee, I would like to present you with a framed copy of the Virginia Republican Creed. From what I know of you, the statements that are listed there sum up a lot of your life and encapsulate a lot of who you are and a lot of who all of us strive to be. Thank you very much, Al. We have one last duty for you this morning. I believe for the first time in the history of these breakfasts, you actually get to give one of your pictures away to somebody. So right. Pick well.
I can't imagine why anybody would want to find it. Well, let's see. Chuck Stites.
Chuck Stites. Chuck, we have the output here if you want to come and take a look at that action meeting. You can pick one and only one. We had someone try to walk off with the whole book one time. But come on up here. Al, thank you very much, not only for speaking here today, but for the years of service that you've given to our country, to our committee, the fabulous door prizes that you give us. That's a phenomenal treasure in and of itself. Your service is greatly appreciated, and we hope to have you around for many more years, rendering much more service than you've done so far.
The Albemarle Republican Breakfast Meeting is held on the second Saturday of every month at the Golden Corral Steakhouse restaurant on Route 29 North, next to the main post office.